He called him boy like the word still belonged to another century, like it could still shrink a man in broad daylight and make a room forget what dignity looked like. The bullpen of South Division Precinct froze for half a heartbeat, just long enough for every pair of eyes to register what had been said and long enough for no one to challenge it. Elijah Carter stood near the front desk in a charcoal jacket still damp from the cold February drizzle outside, one hand resting on a sealed brown envelope, the other at his side, open and still. The fluorescent lights overhead cast that washed-out government glare that made everything look tired, from the stained tile floor to the faded flag in the corner to the coffee rings on the reception counter. Somewhere deeper in the building, a radio crackled. A copier spat out paper. A metal door clicked shut. And in the middle of all that routine noise stood Captain Ryan Whitmore, broad-shouldered, jaw-locked, eyes narrowed with the kind of suspicion that had nothing to do with law and everything to do with power. Elijah had walked in less than a minute earlier, calm, measured, asking to leave a federal packet for Lieutenant Daniel Reeves and waiting exactly where the desk officer told him to wait. He had not raised his voice. He had not stepped past the line on the floor. He had not done a single thing that could honestly be called threatening. But some men did not need a reason. Some men only needed a face, a posture, a quiet confidence they did not think belonged in black skin. Whitmore looked Elijah up and down and smirked like he had solved a problem no one else could see. "Boy, I asked you a question," he said again, louder now, for the room, for the uniforms pretending to work, for the clerk whose fingers stopped over her keyboard, for the rookie by the hallway trying not to stare. Elijah lifted his eyes and met the captain's without flinching. His voice came out low and controlled. "I'm here to deliver something for Lieutenant Reeves." That should have ended it. In another building, maybe it would have. But Whitmore stepped closer, the leather of his duty belt creaking, his expression hardening at the sight of a black man who didn't lower his gaze. "Deliver what exactly?" he asked. Elijah's fingers stayed on the envelope. "Federal documents." Whitmore's laugh was short and humorless. "Federal, huh? That's what we're calling it now." He reached for the packet before Elijah could answer, then stopped just short, as if the pause itself gave him authority. The front desk clerk glanced at the seal on the envelope and looked away too quickly. Elijah noticed. So did the young officer by the hall. Tiny things. The kind most people missed. The kind that mattered later. Elijah took a slow breath. "Captain," he said, choosing each word carefully, "I'd rather you call Lieutenant Reeves before this goes any further." A few heads turned at that. Not because the sentence was loud, but because of how steady it was. Whitmore's lips curled. "Before this goes any further? You making threats in my station now?" "No," Elijah said. "I'm trying to stop you from making a mistake." For one suspended second, the whole room seemed to tighten around those words. Then Whitmore's hand moved to his cuffs, and the temperature in the precinct seemed to drop all at once. Outside, through the rain-streaked glass doors, red and blue reflections began to flicker across the wet pavement, still distant, still unreal, like the city itself was taking a breath before the truth came through the front door. Whitmore let the silence hang the way some men let smoke hang in a room, as if discomfort itself proved they were in control. Then he gave a small nod toward Officer Ben Keating, the youngest uniform in the bullpen, and said, "Search him." Keating hesitated just long enough for the hesitation to be noticed. He was fresh out of the academy, still carrying that look some rookies had before the job either hardened them or hollowed them out. His hand hovered near his belt, but his eyes drifted to the envelope first, then to Elijah, then to the front desk clerk whose expression had turned strangely pale. "Captain," Keating said carefully, "he is just standing here." Whitmore turned his head with a slowness that made the whole room tense. "You questioning an order, officer?" "No, sir," Keating answered, though his voice had lost some of its certainty. Elijah remained still. That was what made Whitmore angrier than he wanted to admit. Fear, he understood. Anger, he knew how to provoke. But composure, especially this kind of composure, quiet and immovable, had a way of exposing men who relied on volume to feel powerful. Whitmore stepped in and took over, brushing past Keating with the irritation of someone who believed hesitation was weakness. He took the envelope from Elijah's hand and looked at the federal seal again, this time longer, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly before he masked it with contempt. "Anybody can buy fancy stationery," he muttered. Elijah watched him without changing expression. "There is a name on the inside packet," he said. Lieutenant Reeves is expecting it. Then maybe Reeves can come down and tell me why some stranger walked into my precinct acting like he owns the place. Whitmore snapped. The words landed louder than they should have in that fluorescent hush. At the reception desk, the clerk finally found her voice. Her name badge read Marisol Vega, and when she spoke, it came out soft, almost buried beneath the hum of the lights. Captain, Lieutenant Reeves is upstairs in briefing. I can call him. Whitmore did not look at her. No need. We are handling it. But Marisol had already picked up the phone, then stopped halfway, as if an invisible line had been drawn across the room. Elijah noticed that too. Everybody noticed everything now. That was the problem with moments like this. Once a room understood it was witnessing something wrong, every second became a choice. Look around, Whitmore said, holding the envelope loosely in one hand like it was junk mail. This is what happens when people think a seal and a serious face can get them into places they do not belong. Elijah's gaze shifted, not away, but past him, toward the hallway and the locked doors beyond it. He measured distances the way other people measured moods. The rain outside tapped harder against the precinct windows, a thin, persistent rhythm undercutting the tension. He spoke with the same calm he had carried since walking in. Captain Whitmore, please put that packet down and call Lieutenant Reeves. This is your last simple option. The phrasing was so precise that it unsettled the room more than a shout ever could have. Whitmore smiled, but there was no warmth in it now, only performance. My last simple option? He shook his head as if he were amused, then looked around to make sure everyone was watching. You hear that? He is giving me options in my own station. A few forced chuckles rose and died almost immediately. No one wanted ownership of them. Keating shifted his weight. Marisol lowered her eyes. Somewhere upstairs, a door opened and closed. Somewhere outside, engines rolled closer through the rain. Whitmore set the envelope on the counter at last, but only so he could reach for Elijah's wrist and guide him toward the holding corridor with that falsely polished tone officials used when they wanted control to sound reasonable. Until we sort out who you are and why you are here, you are not going anywhere. Elijah did not resist. He only turned his head slightly toward the front doors, where the flashing reflections had grown brighter against the glass, and for the first time a real change moved through his face. Not fear, not triumph, just recognition. He had been waiting for that sound. The low growl of multiple government SUVs idling in the rain. The first agent through the door did not need to raise her voice to change the entire temperature of the room. She stepped out of the gray rain in a dark federal windbreaker, her hair pulled back, her expression calm in the way only serious people could afford to be. Special Agent Naomi Brooks scanned the bullpen once, took in Whitmore's grip on Elijah, the packet on the counter, the frozen clerk, the rookie by the hall, and the bright red reflections still sliding across the floor from the SUVs outside. Then she reached into her coat, displayed her credentials, and said, "Nobody moves away from their station until I say otherwise." The sentence was clean, measured, and final. It landed harder than a shout. For a second, no one breathed. Whitmore's hand fell from Elijah's wrist, not because he wanted to let go, but because instinct had finally collided with information. Behind Naomi came 5 more agents in weather-dark jackets, followed by a lean man in glasses carrying 2 hard case binders and a woman wheeling a compact evidence card across the tile. The bullpen that had felt so certain a moment ago now looked smaller, as if the walls had pulled inward around the truth. Whitmore straightened. His expression tried to find its old authority again, but it kept slipping. "What is this?" he asked, too quickly, too sharply. Naomi did not look at him first. She looked at Elijah. "Mr. Carter, are you all right?" Elijah gave a small nod. "I am now." Only then did Naomi turn to Whitmore. "This facility is being secured pursuant to a federal action involving obstruction, tampering with records, and interference with an active investigation." Her eyes shifted briefly to the envelope on the counter. "Captain Ryan Whitmore, step away from that packet." The color in Whitmore's face changed almost imperceptibly, like a light dimming behind a window. "You cannot just walk in here and shut down my precinct over some paperwork mix-up," he said. "Mix-up," Naomi repeated, with a calm that made the words sound dangerous. She took a single step forward. "Captain, the man you detained brought protected materials directly tied to a federal inquiry that has been running for 11 months. He was instructed to place that packet in Lieutenant Reeves's hands only." Instead, you intercepted it, detained him, and created a witness-rich event in front of half your staff and multiple recording devices. She glanced toward the small red light on the hallway camera, then to the body camera centered on Keating's chest. Several officers noticed it at the same time. The room shifted again. Lieutenant Daniel Reeves appeared at the top of the stairs then, having heard enough commotion to break from briefing. He stopped halfway down when he saw Naomi, the agents, and Elijah standing free. Reeves was a tall man in his early 50s with the face of someone who had spent years learning how to survive systems without becoming them. His eyes went first to the envelope, then to Elijah, then to Whitmore. "Dear God," Reeves said under his breath. Whitmore turned toward him like a drowning man spotting land. "Lieutenant, tell them this is nonsense." Reeves did not answer him. He came down the last steps slowly, every one of them heavy with recognition. "Mr. Carter was supposed to be escorted directly to my office," he said. Naomi nodded once. "That will be included in the record." Marisol lowered her hand from the phone she had never managed to use. Keating looked like someone seeing the whole shape of a story for the first time. Elijah stood in the center of the room, rain drying at the shoulders of his jacket, no longer looking like a man out of place, but like the quiet hinge everything had just turned on. Whitmore followed the stare of every person in the bullpen and finally understood what they understood. He had not interrupted a stranger. He had interrupted the moment the truth arrived. Reeves took the envelope from the counter with both hands, not because it was heavy, but because everything in the room now carried weight. The federal seal that Whitmore had mocked minutes earlier seemed to pull every eye toward it, as if it were the only solid thing left in the bullpen. Naomi watched him break it open, her face unreadable, while the agents behind her spread through the precinct with disciplined efficiency. One moved toward the server room with a printed authorization packet. Another began photographing the front desk, the hallway camera, the evidence locker sign-in board, every surface where routine had just turned into record. The woman with the evidence cart rolled it quietly across the tile, its wheels making a soft mechanical hum under the fluorescent lights. No one joked now. No one shuffled papers just to look busy. The station had gone from performance to exposure in less than 60 seconds, and everybody felt it. Reeves slid the first set of documents from the envelope and scanned the top page. His expression changed almost immediately, not dramatically, but enough for the room to feel it. He looked at Elijah. "Was this the final pull?" Elijah nodded. "Signed and time-stamped at 7:42 this morning." The digital copies were transferred separately. Reeves swallowed once, then handed the first pages to Naomi. Whitmore tried to step closer. "What exactly is in there?" Naomi did not hand the papers to him. She held them just out of reach and said, "Enough to explain why your name appears where it should not. Enough to explain why internal complaint files disappeared after intake. Enough to explain why arrest narratives changed after review. Enough to explain why confiscated property entered storage under one number and left under another." Each sentence was delivered without anger, which made them feel even sharper. In the silence between them, the rain tapping the precinct windows sounded almost delicate. Whitmore's mouth tightened. He looked around for support and found none that mattered. Marisol kept her eyes on her desk, but her hands had stopped shaking. Keating stood straighter now, as if some inner confusion had finally chosen a side. Two older officers near the copy room stared hard at the floor, the way men do when they realize distance will not save them from memory. Elijah said nothing. He did not need to. Imagine standing in a room where people dismissed you the moment you walked in, where one word was supposed to reduce you, where a single slur was meant to remind you who held power. And then imagine that same room learning, one page at a time, that your silence had never been submission. It had been timing. Reeves flipped deeper into the file. His jaw set when he reached the financial charts. Monthly deposits, shell vendors, city reimbursements that did not match inventory logs. Next came transcripts from protected interviews, each one detailing the same pattern in different voices. Stops that became searches, searches that became charges, charges that dissolved only after damage had already been done. Not one story was identical, but together they formed a shape too deliberate to dismiss. Reeves looked up slowly. "Ryan," he said, and for the first time there was no rank in his voice, only disappointment. "How long has this been going on?" Whitmore laughed once, dry and brittle. "You are going to take his word over mine?" Naomi answered before Reeves could. "We are taking the records, the timestamps, the testimony, the audit trail, and the surveillance review. Mr. Carter is not the case. He is the courier who walked your corruption through the front door." The line settled over the bullpen like a verdict. One of the agents near the hallway spoke into an earpiece and confirmed that the server images were in progress. Another announced that the evidence room access logs had already been copied. The rhythm of the raid became impossible to ignore. This was not a warning. This was a harvest. Whitmore looked at Elijah then, really looked at him, and whatever he expected to find in that face, it was not there. No grin, no triumph, no revenge. Only a steady, exhausted dignity that made everything Whitmore had said earlier sound even smaller than it had in the moment. Elijah met his stare and spoke with the same quiet control he had carried from the beginning. "I asked you to make one phone call." The words were simple, but they hollowed the room out. Because everyone remembered them now. Everyone remembered the envelope, the warning, the chance he had offered. Outside, another federal vehicle pulled into the lot, its headlights washing pale gold across the rain-dark glass. Inside, the precinct no longer felt like Whitmore's station. It felt like the place where his certainty had finally run out. For a long moment, the only thing louder than the rain was the sound of paper turning. Reeves kept reading, each page pulling him farther from denial and deeper into something colder than shock. The precinct had always carried its own weather, the stale coffee, the old heat, the fluorescent hum, the quiet hierarchy of who spoke and who stayed silent. But now another atmosphere had settled over the place, one built from exposed records and the kind of truth that did not need to shout to dominate a room. Naomi handed a second file to the agent with the glasses, and he began cross-checking the names inside against intake logs from a black hard drive that had just been removed from the records office. One by one, timestamps aligned. Property tags matched missing forms. Complaint numbers that had supposedly been closed as clerical errors appeared again under revised narratives. Different months, different victims, same fingerprints of control. Whitmore stood near the counter with the stiff posture of a man trying to hold himself together by force of habit alone. His eyes darted from Naomi to Reeves to Elijah and back again, as if certainty might still be hiding in one of their faces. It was not. It was gone now. In its place was record, process, consequence. Marisol finally looked up from her desk when one of the federal agents asked for the phone logs from the front station line. Her voice was quiet, but steady now. "The outgoing calls are saved by extension. The captain's line too." Naomi gave her a small nod that was not exactly comfort, but close enough to feel human. Keating watched that exchange from the hallway and understood something simple and devastating all at once. Courage did not always look like a grand gesture. Sometimes it looked like a clerk answering clearly. Sometimes it looked like a rookie not looking away. Sometimes it looked like a man who had been insulted in public still choosing calm when every eye in the room expected him to break. Elijah stood beside the counter, jacket drying in patches under the overhead lights, and let the silence work for him. He had spent too many years learning how institutions listened only after they were forced to hear themselves. He had seen reports rewritten with softer language, seen doubt placed over facts like a sheet over furniture, seen ordinary people pushed into permanent damage by temporary abuses of power. That was why he had agreed to help. Not because he believed one raid could heal everything. Not because he believed one captain falling would fix a system built to protect its own. But because there are moments when truth gets a door, and if no one walks it through, the door closes again. Reeves reached the final pages and exhaled through his nose, slow and controlled. When he looked up, his face had changed. The hesitation was gone. "Ryan," he said, "you did not just embarrass this department today. You exposed it." Whitmore shook his head. "You think they are using him because they care about justice?" He turned toward the room, trying to gather support from people who no longer wanted to be gathered. "This is politics. This is theater." Naomi answered without raising her voice. "No, Captain. Theater is what happened before we arrived. Theater was the insult. Theater was the public detention. Theater was pretending authority was the same thing as integrity. This is documentation." Her words seemed to settle over every desk, every radio, every badge in the room. An agent at the far end of the bullpen called out that the first server extraction was complete. Another confirmed that body camera uploads from the last 90 days had been mirrored. The evidence cart, once nearly invisible against the routine clutter of the station, had become the quiet center of the morning. Small sealed bags now held sign-in sheets, flash drives, handwritten notes, and 2 spiral notebooks recovered from a locked drawer in Whitmore's office. No sirens, no chaos, just the clean mechanical sound of a system finally turning in the other direction. Whitmore looked at Elijah again, and this time there was something new in his face. Not remorse, not yet, but the first unmistakable trace of fear that comes when a man realizes the world he relied on has stopped translating for him. Elijah met that look with the same stillness he had carried from the beginning. He did not need to say much. He only said, "You kept calling me out of my name because you thought. I came in here alone." That line moved through the room like a current, because it was true in more ways than one. Elijah had walked in without backup at his shoulder, without a badge on his belt, without any visible symbol men like Whitmore respected. But he had not come alone. He had come with records, with witnesses, with timestamps, with every buried complaint that refused to stay buried. And now the precinct knew it too. Outside, the rain finally began to ease, softening against the windows into a fine silver mist. Inside, under the hard white lights, the long protected story of that building was starting to lose control of its ending. By then the raid had developed its own rhythm, precise and unhurried, the kind of rhythm that did not depend on panic because it had come prepared for resistance, denial, and silence in equal measure. Agents moved through South Division with the confidence of people following a map they had already memorized. Doors opened with authorization. Cabinets were photographed before they were touched. Computer towers were labeled, disconnected, and packed into foam-lined cases. Even the old bulletin board near the break room, the one cluttered with faded commendations and community flyers curling at the corners, was photographed because investigators knew that patterns hid in ordinary places. The precinct had spent years teaching itself how to look normal. That was over now. Naomi stood beside Reeves at the front counter while he reread the witness summary attached to Elijah's packet. The pages included names from traffic stops, booking incidents, property seizures, and complaint intakes, all threaded together by dates, transfer codes, and small inconsistencies that meant nothing alone and everything together. It was not one explosion of wrongdoing. It was something colder. Repetition. Design. Elijah watched Reeves read with the expression of a man who had waited a long time for someone inside the building to finally see what had been right in front of them. Keating stepped closer, careful, uncertain, but no longer trying to disappear. "Special Agent Brooks," he said, "if body camera uploads were mirrored, then the old archive server in records has backup transfers from night shift too." Whitmore always said it was redundant storage. Naomi turned to him. "Was it ever audited?" Keating shook his head. "Not since I got here." She glanced at the agent near the records office. "Pull that." "Server 2. Keating nodded once, as if something inside him had settled. He was no hero. He knew that. He was just a young officer finally understanding that neutrality inside a crooked room was never neutral at all. Whitmore heard the exchange and stepped forward with a brittle edge in his voice. "You are really going to let a rookie help tear down his own station?" Reeves answered this time. "No, Ryan. We are going to let him tell the truth before this place teaches him not to." The line landed hard, not because it was loud, but because too many people in that room knew it was true. Near the copy room, one of the older officers slowly sat down in his chair and rubbed both hands over his face. Another leaned against the wall, eyes fixed on nothing, as if replaying every report he had signed without asking enough questions. Marisol printed the outgoing call log from the front desk and handed it to an agent with steadier hands than she had worn all morning. Extension 42 made repeated calls to a private number listed under a contracting company that did not exist on any public city vendor sheet. The agent marked the page and slid it into an evidence sleeve. Small things. That was how Rod hid. In call logs. In corrected timestamps. In property numbers with one digit changed. In the extra sentence added after midnight when no one expected anyone to compare drafts. Elijah knew that better than anyone standing there. For 11 months, he had carried stories that never made headlines because they were too ordinary to attract cameras and too devastating to forget once you heard them. A father whose car was impounded under a false notation and lost his job because he could not make it to work for 3 days. a college freshman whose scholarship interview was missed after an arrest that quietly vanished from the system, but not from his record search. A widow whose late husband's watch entered evidence after a traffic stop and was never seen again. None of it had the spectacle people expected from corruption. That was the point. Most cruelty survived by looking administrative. Naomi took the fresh printout from the agent and compared it to the financial chart from Elijah's file. The same number. The same date cluster. She exhaled slowly. There it is. She looked to Reeves. The vendor payments routed through a shell account line up with your missing property cycle. Reeves closed his eyes for 1 second. No more. When he opened them again, whatever hope remained that this might be containable had left with it. Whitmore tried one last time to reclaim the room. You all think he is some saint because he walked in here with a packet and a calm voice? You do not know anything about him. Elijah answered before Naomi could. You are right, Captain. You did not know anything about me. He spoke without heat, which only made the words sharper. You did not know who I had spoken to. You did not know what had already been copied. You did not know how many people had finally agreed to testify once they learned they were not the only ones. And you did not know that this morning was never about whether I could walk into this building. It was about whether this building could survive the truth walking in with me. The bullpen went still again, but it was a different stillness now, not suspense, but recognition. Outside, the last of the rain had faded into a gray mist hanging low over the lot. Inside, agents wheeled out the first sealed equipment case, and every person who watched it pass understood the same thing. This was no longer a bad morning that might be explained away by afternoon. It was the beginning of an official memory, the kind that entered evidence, moved through court, and refused to be edited after the fact. Under the white glare of government lights, with paper, servers, logs, and witness statements stacking into order, South Division Precinct was learning what power felt like when it no longer belonged to the loudest man in the room. The first person to speak after that was not an agent, not a captain, not even Reeves. It was Officer Ben Keating, and his voice carried the strained honesty of someone stepping across an invisible line for the first time in his life. Captain Whitmore had me rewrite an inventory discrepancy 2 weeks ago, he said, eyes fixed forward, not on Whitmore, not on Elijah, but somewhere just beyond fear. Said the serial number had been entered wrong by booking. I did not think much of it then. Naomi turned to him fully. Do you remember the case number? Keating nodded and recited it from memory with the careful precision of a man who had replayed the moment more than once. An agent wrote it down immediately. Another began searching the mirrored intake logs. Across the bullpen, the older officer near the copy room let out a breath that sounded almost like surrender. Then he spoke too. There were other times, he said quietly. Property came back light. Some forms did not match. We were told it was administrative backlog. The station absorbed those words in stunned silence because everyone knew what was happening now. The wall was not cracking. It was answering. Whitmore's face hardened with the effort of trying to hold control over people who had already begun slipping outside his reach. You are all really doing this in front of federal outsiders? He asked, scanning the room like outrage might restore loyalty. Marisol looked up from her desk before anyone else could answer. They are not outsiders, Captain. Not anymore. It was a small sentence, almost gentle in its delivery, but it carried years inside it. Years of watching, years of typing things she was told not to question, years of learning which names made supervisors lower their voices. Reeves closed the file in front of him and rested both palms against the counter. The sound was soft, but decisive. Ryan, he said, if you have anything to say that helps the record, say it now. If not, stop turning this into a loyalty test for people you left exposed. For a second, Whitmore just stared at him, as if he could not understand the grammar of being spoken to that way. Elijah did understand it. He had spent 11 months watching people reach this exact point, the instant where private discomfort finally became public truth. It never happened dramatically. It happened like this, in inches, through ordinary voices deciding they could no longer afford the price of silence. An agent at Records called out that the backup server had been secured and the first image contained deleted transfer directories tied to overnight upload windows. Naomi asked for a timestamp. The answer came back within seconds. 3 of the deletions lined up with the same weeks listed in Elijah's witness packet. One coincided with the property log Keating had just identified. Another matched a complaint Marisol remembered entering under a different spelling after she was told the original file was corrupted. The building itself seemed to be confessing now. Elijah watched the realization pass from desk to desk, face to face, like light moving through blinds. Imagine standing there after being reduced to a word, after being told by a man in authority that you did not belong, and then watching that same authority lose its shape one witness at a time. Not because you shouted louder, not because you forced the room, but because truth had finally given everyone else permission to stop pretending. Naomi turned to Whitmore again, though by now she no longer needed to raise any question for the room to answer itself. "Captain, did you direct personnel to alter intake classifications on seized property?" Whitmore laughed once, but there was panic under it now, thin and metallic. "You think I ran some empire out of a precinct bullpen? This is ridiculous." Reeves answered in a tired voice that carried more grief than anger. "No, Ryan. I think you counted on everyone believing the damage was too small to matter and too scattered to prove. That was the mistake." The line hung in the air long after he finished speaking, because that was how it had worked for so long. Nothing was ever supposed to look large enough to become scandal. Just one missed item, one changed line, one person nobody important would believe. Elijah knew every version of that story. He had sat in church basements and legal aid offices and cramped apartments listening to people talk themselves into minimizing what had happened to them, because institutions had trained them to think pain had to be spectacular before it counted. That was why this morning mattered. Not because one precinct was special, but because ordinary injustice had finally been arranged into undeniable order. Naomi took a thin folder from the evidence card and slid it across the counter toward Reeves. Inside were sworn statements from 3 former employees, 2 citizens, and 1 retired supervisor who had agreed to testify under federal protection. Reeves read the cover page, then looked at Elijah with something close to regret. "You carried all this alone?" Elijah shook his head. "Not alone. Quietly. There is a difference." Another sealed equipment case rolled past them toward the front door. Through the glass, the gray morning had brightened just enough to make the wet pavement shine like steel. A local news van had stopped at the far end of the lot, still too distant to hear, but close enough to signal where the story would go next. Inside, however, the real shift had already happened. This was no longer a room full of people waiting for orders. It was a room full of people deciding what kind of witness they were willing to become. By mid-morning, the precinct no longer sounded like a precinct at all. The usual rhythm of radios, phones, and half-finished conversations had been replaced by the quieter, more unnerving sounds of documentation. Printers fed out logs. Evidence sleeves crackled. Agents spoke in low, precise tones that left no room for confusion or comfort. Through the glass front doors, the parking lot had changed too. 2 local news vans now sat beyond the chain-link entrance, their antennas raised against the damp gray sky, while city officials began arriving in dark sedans that looked too polished for a place like South Division. The story had started moving beyond the building. Inside, however, the most important shift remained in the faces of the people who worked there. Men who had once leaned back with easy confidence now stood with their shoulders drawn in. A woman from records who had barely spoken all morning quietly handed over a paper ledger she said she was told never to digitize. A dispatcher from the back office asked if someone could take a statement about calls rerouted away from internal review. The precinct had become what it had tried for years not to become, a place where memory finally outranked rank. Naomi stood at the center of it with the same unbroken calm, reviewing each new item as though she had expected the flood once the first lock gave way. In truth, she had. Systems like this rarely collapsed because of one revelation. They collapsed because one undeniable fact made everyone else stop carrying the lie for free. Reeves remained beside her, but there was something different in the way he held himself now. He no longer looked like a lieutenant trying to save a department's reputation. He looked like a man measuring how much had been lost while he was still inside the room. Whitmore felt that shift before anyone named it. He stood near the front of the bullpen, isolated now not by order but by gravity, as if the truth itself had created a circle around him no one wanted to cross. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, stripped of the swagger that had filled the station earlier. "You think this ends with me," he said. That line was not defiance. It was warning, maybe even confession disguised as contempt. Naomi met his eyes. No, Captain, it does not. That is why we are here. She nodded toward an agent who had just carried over a slim stack of newly printed email recoveries. The metadata tied city procurement contacts to off-book vendor payments. Another set linked supervisory review windows to edited arrest language in cases involving seized cash and personal property. This was no longer about one man's prejudice spilling into a public scene, though that alone had been ugly enough. It was about how bias and bureaucracy had learned to help each other. Elijah understood that better than anyone in the room. He had not spent 11 months moving between interviews, legal offices, church basements, and parking lot handoffs just to expose one captain with a bad mouth and a dirty desk. He had done it because men like Whitmore were rarely alone. They were protected by process, by exhaustion, by the quiet calculation that most people could not afford to fight paperwork and power at the same time. Elijah looked toward the rain-dulled windows where the reflection of the bullpen shimmered faintly against the glass and thought of all the people whose names sat inside those files. A teacher who had lost her savings after cash seized during a stop was never correctly returned. A delivery driver suspended after a false notation followed him into a background check. A grandmother who stopped reporting what happened because every office she called redirected her to another. Ordinary people. That was always the point. The damage stayed hidden because the victims were expected to absorb it and move on. Reeves picked up one of the witness statements again and read a line that described an officer laughing while a complaint form was misplaced for the second time. He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them and looked at Whitmore with a weariness deeper than anger. I kept telling myself these were isolated failures, he said. That phrase moved through the room like smoke because everyone had heard some version of it before. Isolated. Miscommunication. Clerical. Procedural. The soft language institutions used when they wanted harm to sound accidental. Whitmore did not answer. For the first time since Elijah entered the building, he seemed to understand that words were no longer obeying him. They were becoming record instead. Naomi took a fresh document from the evidence card and held it out to Reeves. It was a preliminary suspension order, already coordinated with federal oversight and the city attorney's office. Reeves read it, signed where indicated, and handed it back without ceremony. No shouting, no dramatic gesture, just ink on paper, authority redirected. One of the agents informed Whitmore that he was to step away from operational command effective immediately and remain available for formal processing. The bullpen watched in total silence. No one smirked. No one celebrated. There was something heavier than satisfaction in the room now, something closer to recognition. Because power did not always collapse with noise. Sometimes it simply stopped being believed. Whitmore's gaze moved across the station one last time, searching for old alliances in familiar desks and walls, but the building no longer mirrored him back. It had turned. Elijah stood near the counter, hands relaxed at his sides, not triumphant, not vindictive, just present in a way that could no longer be dismissed. Whitmore looked at him as if still trying to reconcile the man he had reduced with the man who had helped unravel an entire precinct before lunch. Elijah held his stare and spoke with the same steady control he had carried all morning. You thought the word you used could define me, but all it really did was tell everyone in this room who you were. No one moved after he said it. The sentence settled into the station like a final missing piece. Outside, the mist had lifted enough for a weak strip of sunlight to cut across the wet parking lot, turning the puddles pale gold. Inside, under harsh fluorescent light and the watchful eyes of agents, clerks, officers, and witnesses, South Division Precinct was no longer a fortress of routine. It was evidence. By early afternoon, the precinct had the hollow feeling of a place that had finally heard itself. The phone still rang, but every sound now seemed to come from farther away, as if the building had been pushed back from its own center. Federal agents moved. With the same measured focus, carrying sealed cases past desks where officers once sat with casual authority and now stood in careful silence, watching years of habit turn into inventory. Outside, the weak sun kept fighting through the thinning gray, laying a washed gold reflection across the wet pavement where reporters waited behind barriers and camera crews adjusted tripods in the chill air. Inside, no one was performing anymore. There was no swagger left, no easy laughter, no comfort in the old routines. Only paperwork, statements, and the slow, irreversible machinery of accountability. Reeves stood near the front counter signing the last transfer authorizations, while Naomi reviewed the chain of custody on every collected item. Marisol had given her statement. Keating had given his. 2 more officers had quietly asked for legal counsel before speaking further, and even that felt like an answer. The station that once depended on silence had become crowded with truth. Elijah remained near the entrance for a moment, taking it in, not with satisfaction, but with the exhausted stillness of a man who knew the cost of getting this far. He had walked into South Division that morning carrying a sealed packet, but what he had really carried were the names of people who had almost been erased by procedure. He thought of them now, of the teacher, the driver, the widow, the students, the fathers, the ordinary people who had been told in one form or another that what happened to them did not quite count. This was for them. Not a perfect ending. Not some clean miracle where every wound closed by sunset. Real justice did not move like that. It came slower. It came in affidavits, hearings, records, and days like this one, when the lie finally lost administrative cover. Whitmore stood under the same fluorescent lights that had favored him all morning and looked smaller than he had hours earlier, though nothing visible about him had changed. That was the strange thing about power. Sometimes it disappeared before a person even realized it had gone. One of the federal agents approached and informed him that a formal interview room had been prepared and that City Command had been notified of the operational transfer. Whitmore did not argue this time. He only looked once more across the bullpen, at the desks, the clerk, the rookie, the lieutenant, and finally at Elijah. The anger in his face had thinned into something flatter and harder to name. A man staring at the ruins of assumptions he once believed were permanent. Elijah met that stare with quiet clarity. He did not need revenge. The room had already seen enough. He only said, "You called me boy because you thought the badge made you bigger than the truth. But a badge cannot hide a man when the truth knows his name." Whitmore said nothing after that. He lowered his eyes for one brief second, and in that second the whole station seemed to understand what had actually happened there. Not just that a captain had lost command. Not just that the Federal Bureau of Investigation had entered with warrants and cases and hard drives. It was something deeper. A room that had once bent around one man's arrogance had finally refused to bend. Naomi walked over and stopped beside Elijah near the door. "You did good today," she said quietly. Elijah looked out through the glass at the pale sun breaking over the wet lot, at the news vans, the city cars, the gathered attention of a world that only now seemed ready to notice. He answered in the same calm voice he had carried from the beginning. "It should not take all this for people to be treated like they belong." Naomi nodded once, because there was nothing to add to that. Reeves approached a moment later, his face marked by fatigue and something that looked very close to shame. "I should have seen more," he said. Elijah turned to him. "Then see it now," he replied. "Make that mean something." Reeves held his gaze and gave a slow, solemn nod. It was not absolution. It was responsibility. Elijah pushed open the glass door and stepped into the cool afternoon air. The mist had lifted. The rain was gone. All around him cameras shifted, microphones rose, reporters leaned forward, hungry for the spectacle of collapse. But Elijah did not hurry and he did not pose. He simply walked past them with the same steady dignity he had carried into the building hours before, except now no one mistook it for weakness. Behind him, South Division Precinct stood in the thin winter sunlight looking less like a fortress than a warning. Because in the end, the word that man used to make Elijah feel small did not define Elijah at all. It defined the man who said it. And when truth finally entered the room, it did not need to shout. It only needed to stay long enough for everyone to hear the echo.